Hi everyone, welcome to the War Connoisseur. Hope you enjoyed today's video and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.
The beautiful Meuse bridges had been destroyed. Belgium was ready for war. I was in Hervé the same evening, my first headquarters on enemy soil. We spent the night at an inn opposite the station. The whole town was intact, and we went to bed with a quiet mind. During the night I was awakened by brisk firing, some of which was directed on our house. The franc-tireur warfare in Belgium had begun. It broke out everywhere the next day, and it was this sort of thing which aroused that intense bitterness that during those first years characterized the war on the Western Front in contrast to the feeling prevailing in the East. The Belgian government took a grave responsibility upon itself. It had systematically organized civilian warfare. The Garde Civique, which in the days of peace had its own arms and special uniforms, were able to appear sometimes in one garb and sometimes in another. The Belgian soldiers must also have had a special civilian suit in their knapsacks at the commencement of the war. In the trenches near Fort Barchon, to the northeast of Liège, I myself saw uniforms which had been left behind by soldiers who had fought there. Such action was not in keeping with the usages of war. Our troops cannot be blamed if they took the sternest measures to suppress it. It is true that innocent persons may have had to suffer, but the stories of Belgian atrocities are nothing but clever, elaborate and widely advertised legends. I zealously devoted myself to the training and education of the regiment, and afterwards had the satisfaction of learning that it proved its worth in the face of the enemy. It was a great pleasure to me when, in the course of the war, I was first placed à la suite of my regiment, and, later, appointed its colonel. At the time of my resignation it was named after me. I am, indeed, proud of the General Ludendorff Fusilier Regiment. In April 1914 I went to Strasbourg, where General von Daim-Ling's presence ensured an active military life for every man in his command. The position as brigade commander was quite different from that of regimental commander in Düsseldorf. I missed the direct intercourse with the troops and the corps of officers, and was occupied chiefly with organisation. Before the outbreak of war, I had the pleasure of parading my brigade for inspection at Bitch. There was again a question of my being appointed as Quartermaster General on the Great General Staff. I was, of course, doing general staff work. In May I took part in a staff ride, which began in Freiburg in Breisgau and ended in Cologne. His Imperial Highness the Crown Prince was with us. He devoted himself with great zeal to his work and showed both sound understanding of military affairs and insight into large-scale operations. In August, I had to conduct a so-called supply ride, in which the strategical plan for the supply of an army was examined. Austria-Hungary's note to Serbia at the end of July came as a shock to me in Strasbourg. Nobody could ignore its seriousness. War was soon a certainty. Diplomacy presented the German army with an extremely difficult task. In great anxiety, I followed events in Berlin then, as I still do, feeling that so far as I was concerned, I was not responsible for whatever hap penned. General mobilization was decreed on August 1st. My wife went to Berlin immediately, for the families of all officers and officials were ordered to leave Strasbourg. During the whole 4 years of war, we were unable to set up a home of our own, and I was never able to pay any but short flying visits to my wife. My family had little consideration during these momentous days, for all my time was occupied by my work. Early on the 2nd of August I travelled, with my horses, via Cologne, to Aix-la-Chapelle, which I reached on the same evening. Under mobilization orders I was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff of the Second Army, then commanded by General von Bülow, with General von Lauenstein as his Chief of Staff. Next I had to join General von Emmich, who had been given the task of taking the fortress of Liège by surprise. The troops for this purpose being composed of some quickly mobilized mixed infantry brigades, which had not been brought up to full strength. By this move, it was intended to clear a way through Belgium for the army. I took up my quarters in Aix-la-Chapelle at the Hotel Union. Early on August 3rd, General von Emmich arrived. I had not previously met this distinguished soldier, but from that time onwards I cherished a feeling of deep esteem for him which lasted until the day of his death. His chief of staff was Colonel Count von Lambsdorff, a brilliant officer who won great distinction at Liège and elsewhere. Early on August 4th, the advance over the Belgian frontier began, while in Berlin, the Reichstag, in a patriotic demonstration, voted its support to the government, and the party leaders, after the speech from the throne had been read, vociferously proclaimed their unconditional allegiance to the Kaiser, come what might. The same day I had my first experience of fighting in an engagement near Wies, close to the Dutch frontier. It was evident that Belgium had long been prepared for our advance. The roads had been systematically pulled up and barricaded, showing that a great deal of work had been done beforehand. No such obstacles could be found, by US, on the southwest frontier of Belgium. Why had Belgium not taken similar precautions against France? The question as to whether we could secure the bridges at Vissey intact was one of special importance. I went on to visit von der Marwitz's cavalry, which was then on its way to the town, but was able to advance only slowly, because one barricade after another barred the way. At my request, a cyclist company was sent to reconnoitre. After a short while, a cyclist returned with the news that the company had entered Weisse and been completely annihilated. I went with 2 men to see for myself, and to my joy I found the company intact with the exception of the leader, who had been badly wounded by a shot fired from the opposite bank of the Meuse. This little episode was useful to me later on, for it taught me to be more sceptical of such canards, or, as they were subsequently called, L of C yarns. Discipline and training in peacetime, which was to make up for our inferiority in numbers in the coming war. My aim was to turn highly disciplined troops into responsible men possessed of initiative. Discipline is not intended to kill character, but to develop it. The purpose of discipline is to bring about uniformity in cooperating for the attainment of a common goal, and this uniformity can only be obtained when each one sets aside the thought of his own personal interests. This common goal is victory. Words fail to describe the demands that are made of a soldier in battle. To go over the top under enemy fire is indeed an heroic act, but it is by no means the most difficult. How much resolution and readiness to shoulder responsibility is required of a man who either has to lead or send others to certain death. Those are acts, the appalling nature of which no one can imagine who has not himself had to perform them. Besides the care of the men and the education of the non-commissioned officers, an education which was also calculated to assist them in their future callings, I attached the greatest importance to increasing the efficiency of the officers' corps and the training of the younger officers. While the personnel of the regular officers' corps is always the same, the officers of the reserve, the NCOs and men change continually. So the officers' corps is the mainspring of the army. The officers must therefore be thoroughly conversant with the army's great deeds and possess a comprehensive knowledge of their country's history, as it is expected of all men who have to lead others. Nothing can be torn from its historical context without serious prejudice. No one should forget that in times of danger, the guardianship of the fortunes of the state devolves upon the officer, supported by the NCO. This explains the exclusiveness of the officers' corps and their holding aloof from political life. I aimed at making my officers conversant with the conditions of modern warfare and endeavoured to strengthen in them that self-assurance which is essential to the fulfilment of their difficult task, but must not develop into arrogance. To Dusseldorf, as commanding officer of the 39th Fusiliers, I attributed the change partly to my having pressed for those 3 additional army corps. Regimental work is full of life and activity. Active dealings and constant and close cooperation with and for the men who were entrusted to my care, the training of officers, NCOs and men, and the military education of the youth to manhood particularly attracted me after a long period of staff work. For 13 years I had had nothing to do with the routine of a regiment. Now my chief work was the inspection of recruits. In the 80s of the last century, I had on 7 different occasions had charge of recruits. with the 57th Infantry Regiment in Old Wesel and with the Marine Infantry in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel. Later on, I had done several weeks' service with the 8th Body Grenadier Regiment in Frankfurt on the Oder, and from 1898 to 1900 I was in charge of a company of the 61st Infantry Regiment in Thorn, a time I shall never forget. Now that I was in Dusseldorf, I was glad of the experience gained during those years. I realized all the more the great responsibility which rested on me as commanding officer of the regiment, as I saw the coming war rapidly approaching. In various addresses to my officers, I pointed out what extremely serious times we lived in. In the army I saw not only the assurance of Germany's safety and future, but also a guarantee of internal peace. In 1913, thank God, there was not the least sign that the army would have to be used in that capacity. Discipline, to which officer and private alike were subjected, was, in my opinion, the only basis on which an army could be effectively trained for war. Such a training could only be acquired through long service. It is only what discipline makes second nature in a man that is lasting and survives even the demoralizing impressions of the battlefield and the psychological changes wrought by a long campaign. It was our thorough, forced upon us, and that it would be a struggle the like of which the world had never seen. The fact that in non-military circles the probable strength of the enemy was underestimated constituted aerial danger. At the 11th hour, in the autumn of 1912, when there was no longer any doubt as to the enemy's intentions and the army was working with might and main, with truly German devotion to duty, I drew up a plan for an important increase in our effectives, which met with approval from both the more discerning sections of the public and the more far-sighted among our parliamentary parties. I was able to induce General von Moltke to approach the Imperial Chancellor with the plan, who must himself have considered the situation exceedingly serious, for he immediately agreed to it. He instructed the Minister for War to prepare a bill, without, however, carrying on at the same time any clearly denned and systematic political campaign calculated to gauge correctly the attitude of the various powers. This should have occurred to him as a necessary conclusion. Having regard to the purposes for which it was conceived, this army estimated for 1 milliard marks was not of an aggressive character. It merely aimed at adjusting the disproportion in the numerical strength and had in view the absolute enforcement of universal compulsory service, for there were still thousands of able-bodied men who did not serve their country. The budget provided for personnel, but more especially for the strengthening of our fortifications and for more material. All this was voted, but what I had most earnestly desired, the addition of 3 new army corps, was given no consideration. It did not even appear in the estimate. The failure to provide these 3 additional army corps was paid for dearly later on. At the beginning of the war, these additional corps were sorely missed, and the new formations which were produced in the autumn of 1914 displayed all the defects of improvisation. Later on, the new formations were made stronger at the start, but the existing corps, on the other hand, were weakened by the contributions they were called upon to make. However, before the whole bill was passed, I was transferred. Tannius defensive operations in the West implied, as a matter of course, a long war, and was therefore rejected by Count von Schlieffen. When there was no longer any doubt as to the attitude of France and Belgium, Count von Schlieffen's scheme was carried into execution. As to how far General von Moltke conferred with the Imperial Chancellor, von Bethmann, on the question of a march through Belgium, I do not know. In any case, no such negotiations were ever conducted through my department, as it was not a matter with which it was concerned. Whether the Deputy Chiefs of Staff had been consulted is also quite unknown to me. We were all convinced of the soundness of this plan. Nobody believed in Belgium's neutrality. In our unfavourable military-political position in the centre of Europe, surrounded by enemies, we had to reckon with foes greatly superior in numbers and prepare ourselves accordingly, if we did not wish to allow ourselves to be crushed. It was well known how Russia pressed for war and continually increased her army. She was intent on humbling Austria-Hungary once and for all, and becoming mistress of the Balkans. In France, the thought of revenge had revived with renewed vigour. The old German Reichsland was to become French again. Among many other events in France, the reinstatement of the 3 years compulsory service left no doubt of that country's intent. Tions. England contemplated our economic ascendancy, our cheap labour and our restless industry with distinct uneasiness. Moreover, Germany was the greatest land power in Europe, and at the same time had a good fleet in course of expansion. This is what made England fear for her world hegemony. The Anglo-Saxon felt his ancient supremacy threatened. The English government concentrated its fleet, which had had its base of operations until recently in the Mediterranean, in the North Sea and English Channel. Lloyd George's menacing speech on July 21, 191-1, threw a vivid and sudden light on England's intentions, which had hitherto been concealed with great skill. It became increasingly certain that war would be. Far as possible, I accepted any counter-suggestions put forward, but if our cause suffered thereby, I incurred blame of which no one could relieve me. Deeply moved by the events of the 8th August 1918, I placed my post at the disposal of the Field Marshal. There is no question that the terrible disappointments towards the end of the war had worn me out, but my nerves never gave way under the strain. The favorite recollection of my life as a soldier is the coup de main on the fortress. It was a bold operation, in which I was able to fight just like any soldier of the rank and file who proves his worth in battle. At the outbreak of war, I was brigade commander at Strasbourg. For a long time I had been on the general staff, and latterly, from March 1904 to January 1913, with only one short interval in the operations department, of which I was then chief. There I gained an insight into our preparations for war and the relative strength of the opposing forces. My principal work was strategic concentration, the directions for which were given by the Chief of the Staff himself. The scheme of deployment, which was inaugurated in August 1914, was conceived by General Count von Schlieffen, one of the greatest soldiers who ever lived. It was based on the assumption that France would not respect Belgian neutrality or that Belgium would join France. On this assumption, the advance of the German main forces through Belgium followed as a matter of course. Any other plan of campaign would have been crippled owing to the danger from Belgium to the German right flank, and would have precluded a quick and decisive blow at France, which was essential in order to meet in time the great danger of a Russian invasion into the heart of Germany. In the assumed military situation, as countless war games had abundantly demonstrated, an offensive against Russia with simultaneous, the Crown Prince was the victim of the false impression he produced. There was more in him than appeared on the surface. The Chief of the Staff of the German Crown Prince's army group, Colonel Count von der Schulenburg, a very clear-headed and energetic officer, always gave me sound and reliable support. I often visited the army group of Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria also. His alert and uncommonly industrious Chief of Staff, General von Kuhl, was an acquaintance of long standing. I had more than one opportunity of admiring his calm self-possession, even in very serious situations. It would take too long to mention by name the other groups and armies, but I cannot omit a reference to General von Lossberg. This eminent officer and tactician often rendered the greatest assistance to the army and his country. His confidence in me afforded me special satisfaction. During my visits to the front, the various chiefs of staff explained the situation to me in the presence of their army commanders. They always spoke as freely as if they had been officers at general headquarters. They knew I wanted to hear their real views and have a clear idea of the true situation, not a favourable report made to order. Sometimes the armies were instructed to report bare facts only, whether favourable or unfavourable. After the general statement, we would discuss matters, and the army commanders would join in, unless they had explained the situation themselves, an alternative which I particularly appreciated. As a rule, I used to extend my visit, and this enabled me to discuss every kind of question with the army commanders. My intercourse with the armies was not limited to the weekly journeys. Every morning I spoke on the telephone with the chiefs of staff of the armies, and was admitted to their apprehensions and their hopes. They frequently had requests to submit, and they knew that I would help them if I could. I have often had to give them encouragement, but I always felt that they went back to their heavy task with all the more confidence. At times one got a better and fairer general impression of the strategical and tactical situation from the office chair than one could on the spot, where personal impressions had so much greater influence. My conversations on the telephone had the object of collecting information. Only in cases of emergency did I issue orders on these occasions, and then they were always confirmed in writing to the headquarters concerned. It was an understood thing that these conversations were reported to the army commanders. I strongly objected to a Chief of Staff's command. Besides, the army commanders themselves were men of far too independent character to tolerate such a situation. I did hear of cases where orders were given on the authority of General Headquarters, which I would never have approved of. Whenever it occurred, I took strong measures. When I was unable to see for myself, General Headquarters dispatched officers of the General Staff to collect reports from the front or from Army Headquarters, so that we might obtain as clear a picture as possible of the situation on the spot. Changes in the personnel of the higher commands were unavoidable. They were submitted by the Army commands to the Chief of the Military Cabinet, in the case of the General Staff to the Chief of the General Staff. On occasions, General Headquarters suggested changes. This had to be done when it became necessary to have specially experienced officers at the most critical points. It was of advantage to the operations, and particularly to the troops, as it saved many lives. Exchanges between Army and other superior commands also took place during particularly prolonged periods of fighting, more especially if things were going against us. Such periods imposed a terrible nervous strain on them. Worn-out corps headquarters were replaced by others. The change was awkward, but its drawbacks were not insuperable. Complete Army Head. Quarters could not be relieved, as this would have caused too much dislocation in every direction, especially in the work of supply. The only remedy was to relieve individuals. The difficulties involved were the lesser evil of the two. Occasionally, at the suggestion of General Headquarters, Army commanders and their chiefs of staff were relieved when we could be reasonably certain that neither the command nor the troops would suffer from the change. In a war of this duration, a certain loss of energy in individual cases was inevitable. To our great satisfaction, however, such cases were a rarity. It is always a most difficult task to deal with them, and, however conscientious one wishes to be, it is impossible to perform it at all without inflicting hardship and even an injustice at times. As my personal relations with both staffs and troops were harmonious, I enjoyed much confidence. Among my happiest recollections are my relations with the headquarters of the German Crown Prince. He showed a great aptitude for the profession of arms and asked clever and very informed questions. He was fond of the men and did all he could for them. He was not in favour of the war, but advocated peace. That is the truth, whatever others may say to the contrary. The Crown Prince always regretted that he had been insufficiently prepared for his future office as Emperor, and took all possible pains to make good this deficiency. He once told me that he was worse off than a clerk in that respect. He drew up a memorandum on the subject, which he handed to his imperial father and the imperial chancellor. We all met together for meals, which were marked by peculiarly intimate and pleasant intercourse. The field marshal was fond of amusing stories and lively conversation. I used to join in, but liked to discuss service matters also. Of course, we took the greatest care not to mention anything connected with operations. We often had visitors, either at meals or only in the office. Sometimes guests appeared during very critical times. I remember, in October 1914, some gentlemen arrived at Radom with a trainload of gifts for the troops and talked about the prospective capture of Warsaw, while at that very moment I was already contemplating retreat. On such occasions, guests rather got on our nerves, but generally speaking, they cheered us up. From officers of all arms and belonging to all the divisions on the front, we heard how things were going in the army, sometimes better than from long official reports. I attached the greatest importance to our keeping in close touch with the front, and received many hints, which I always followed up. I was particularly fond of these military visits and greatly valued them. Often we had members of the government from Berlin and the states of the Empire. The Imperial Chancellor, von Bethmann Hollweg, paid us a visit at Posen in the autumn of 1914, and again in February 1915 at Lützen. The other chancellors also came to see us often. Sometimes we had visits from members of the Reichstag. I always had the impression that these gentlemen enjoyed being with us, whatever party they belonged to. Towards them and other private individuals, I naturally observed the necessary discretion in speaking of the military situation and my ideas on the subject of peace. Representatives of industry, commerce, and the employers' and workmen's unions came occasionally and sat at our table. Neutral military attachés and military missions who were visiting the front, German and foreign reporters, representatives of the press, scientists and artists, all visited us at various times. At the table of the Commander-in-Chief in the East, representatives from all parts of East and West Prussia were particularly frequent visitors. Many princes were our guests at various times. A visit from His Majesty the Emperor was, of course, a special honour. Even then, conversation was unrestrained, and we felt that His Majesty liked to be with us. I was particularly pleased to have guests at meals, because it gave me an opportunity of bringing up various questions that required discussion. In this way, I saved time later for other military duties. Strength of will and foresight are needed for the command of York's armies, but an intimate knowledge of the composition and organization of the mighty instrument is also necessary, and this can only be acquired and retained by unremitting work. There is yet another requirement, an understanding of the morale of one's own troops and of the peculiarities of the enemy. That cannot be acquired by work. It is, like so many other things, a matter of personality. The greater the task, the more important do these moral factors become. Confidence and faith in ultimate victory are the bonds which unite the leader and his troops. The group and army commands displayed initiative and understanding in assisting us in our extremely arduous task. We always maintained a constant interchange of views with them, although the final decision rested with us. General Headquarters had, further to smooth out difficulties and to preserve a certain unity of view on the many matters which make up the life of an army. The frequent transfers of troops made this particularly important. Subject to these necessary limitations, each command was independent within its own sphere. This was more the case during the war of movement or attack than in stationary warfare and defence. Tactical situations did, of course, arise in which the views of the commands did not agree in matters of detail with those of General Headquarters. The local command was in such cases often allowed to decide the question. For me, this always involved a mental struggle. If they were successful, I was pleased, but if they were not, I felt it was my fault. I attached the greatest importance to verbal discussion and gathering direct impressions on the spot. I used to like going to the front, and as First Quartermaster General always had a special train with separate office and telegraph coaches. Work did not cease during the journey. At pre-arranged stations, the daily reports were handed in as they were at General Headquarters, and, if necessary, we could communicate with wherever we wanted. For this reason, and no other, Colonel Wetzel had to leave me. We separated with the highest regard on both sides. He was succeeded by Colonel High and Major von Stulpnagel. The latter had served on my staff in Berlin for a long time. They were both strong-minded and clear-headed soldiers. With them I passed through the hardest time a soldier can experience. It was the period when it became clear that we could no longer win the war in a military sense. To have to leave them just then was the greatest trial I had to bear. Questions of organisation were dealt with chiefly by Majors von Wollert-Bockelberg and Freiherr von dem Busche and Franert, men with enormous enthusiasm, foresight and capacity for work. Their work was of a high order. 3 of my assistants came prominently before the public. This was due to the nature of their work. Colonel Bauer, a man of remarkable personality, shared my view that the foundations of ultimate success were to be sought in the war efficiency of the people at home, and did all he could to foster and increase it. He played a decisive part in developing the artillery. It was his duty to submit demands for war material to the home authorities and to obtain, with the assistance of employers and workmen, a clear idea of the capability of our industries. His work was closely related to that of the War Ministry. His cooperation and advice were also of the greatest value in matters of military economy and tactics. The head of the political department was General von Bartenwerfer, a calm and clear-headed officer, imbued with fervid patriotism. One important duty of the General Staff in the field was to keep an eye on the military policy of neutrals and enemies, and refer all political questions to which it gave rise to the Imperial Chancellor. It also dealt with political events in the occupied territories, insofar as they were administered by General Headquarters. The frontiers which we might acquire by the war were a matter of the greatest concern to the future security of the country, and all questions connected with them formed an important part of the work of General Headquarters. All correspondence relating to peace questions was conducted by the political department. The third was Lieut. Colonel Nicolai, a man of unfailing industry and devotion to duty and gifted with organizing talent. His duties were multifarious, perhaps too much so. He was responsible for the military direction of the press and the cognate duty of watching and fostering the morale of the army and the people at home, so far as this could be done by military authority. In both these functions, collaboration with the government authorities was essential. We were unsuccessful, and so, as we knew only too well, the direction of the press and the enlightenment of the public remained mere patchwork. The military censorship of the press was another of the functions of Colonel Nicolai and his subordinates. This is one of the necessary evils of war, and from its very nature satisfies nobody. I was very sorry that General Headquarters had to undertake this duty, but all other authorities refused to have anything to do with it. The other great branch of Lieut. Colonel Nicolai's work consisted of the Secret Intelligence Service, prevention of spying, supervision of post, telegraph and telephone services, and the adoption of measures against industrial spying and sabotage, LUT. Colonel Nicolai's intelligence service was of the greatest value to General Headquarters. Uncertainty is of the very nature of war. Even the enemy, in spite of his far more extensive agencies, never knew our intentions. We always surprised him, except on the 15th of July, 1918, an occasion when we made things too easy for him. Major von Rauch, an experienced and careful staff officer, was at the head of the Foreign Armies section, whose duty it was to collect information about the enemy and make it available for the framing of our plans. He proved himself equal to his responsible task. In this direction also, the General Staff did all that could reasonably be expected of it. On my staff there were many other faithful assistants, and I must more particularly specify Colonels von Tischewitz and von Merz, Majors von Waldo, Krantz, von Harbu, Hoffmann, Bartenwerfer, Muths, Captains Wever, Gabriel, Geier, von Fischer-Treunfeld, von Goslar, von Posek. There were many others. That's it for today, everyone. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Stay tuned.